Hello and welcome to Tech for Non-Techies, the only podcast that demystifies the fast-growing technology sector. I'm your host, Sophia Matveyeva, Chicago-based MBA and tech entrepreneur. My aim here is to give you the skills, knowledge and confidence to find opportunities in the tech sector, whether that's through founding a company, getting a dream job, or bringing a fresh perspective to your work. Hello, smart people. How are you? Are you enjoying the summer of love? Are you going on vacation, perhaps? Or is it staycation for you? Perhaps you're watching Netflix shows shot in faraway lands and dreaming of escape. But whatever you're doing, I'm assuming that the majority of you are making plans to remain on Earth. And that's not what Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos have been doing in the last couple of weeks. And you know, I'm not normally interested in the exploits of billionaires, but underneath the recent exploits of Branson and Bezos, there is a rather exciting space tech industry which actually impacts us all. Like the rest of the technology industry, space tech has been going through increasingly rapid change and making new services cheaper and more available. So, this week, we're going to learn about space tech and how investments in space tech affect consumers, businesses, and investors. We're going to hear from Dr. James Lambert, a physicist who works in a privately owned space tech company called Pulsar Fusion. I loved speaking to James for this show, and I hope you find this conversation insightful and entertaining. Welcome to Tech for Non-Techies. I am so pleased to have you here.
Love to be here.
Normally we don't have news-related podcasts here, but you know what? This time I just couldn't help myself because basically there are middle-aged men in phallic symbols flying around in space this week.
Yes, there are.
I thought it is my professional responsibility to my audience to cover what the fuck is going on. Because literally right now, I just see that just today, so we are recording this on the 20th of July, 2021. So Jeff Bezos has just returned from space. And last week, Richard Branson was up in space. So basically, It seems like if you've got lots of money and you're going through a midlife crisis, Ferrari is no longer a thing.
No.
Get yourself a space rocket.
I know.
Okay. So basically, today we're going to talk about space tech with a leader in the field. So James, tell us, what is it that you do in space tech? What is your involvement in the industry?
Sure. So thank you for that introduction, Sophia. For your listeners, my name is James Lambert. I'm head of operations at Pulsar Fusion. We are a space tech startup and we specialize in designing electric propulsion devices. And electric propulsion devices are, imagine rocket thrusters, but incredibly weak ones that you put on satellites, and they allow satellites and small spacecraft to delicately reposition themselves.
Hang on.
Yes.
Let us slow down, because in my life, just in my normal life,
yes,
I don't really have many rocket thrusters. I mean, they sound quite fun, to be honest. It sounds like but you know, for a girl who doesn't have any rocket thrusters lying around at home, would you be able to just slow down a little bit and tell us what is this very promising sounding thing? Why does the world need it?
Why do we need these? Sure. So imagine you put we're all familiar with the big rocket thrusters that get things into orbit. You've seen launches from Cape Canaveral. You've seen Jeff Bezos lift off and there's a big explosion of fire coming out of the back of a rocket.
That's so basically like when there's there's the vibrator bit.
Yeah, the bit at the bottom of that.
And then there's the bit that explodes.
It's the bit at the bottom of the vibrator that explodes with fire. That is a I would be terrible at designing sex toys. That is the part of the rocket that we call a thruster. Now, the ones that put things in orbit burn chemicals. They just produce an enormous chemical explosion to put something in orbit. That is not the sort of technology that I work on. So I work on what they call electric propulsion, and it's used for much more sort of delicate repositioning of spacecraft once they're in space.
So it's basically the rocket bit. It's the motor. It's the engine.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. Its job is to create thrust. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I will.
Steady on.
I will not. Right. Okay. So you are saying that the things that you're creating, they're better for the environment, and essentially that they don't burn as much fuel. Is that correct? Is that right?
Well, actually, it's not an environmental issue. It's a weight issue. Launching stuff into space is amazingly expensive per kilogram that you want to get up there. So if you need to launch a satellite, and that satellite also has to have some propellant on it for its rocket thrusters, you don't want it to have to carry a lot of propellant. You want it to carry a tiny amount that it makes very efficient use of. And that's what I do. I design thrusters that make very efficient use of their propellant.
So basically, if you're like throwing up a thing into space, you just need lots and lots of energy in this thruster, and that is what
you don't need to say excuse me after you say thruster. It's a perfectly valid word.
Oh God. Okay. Yes.
It's okay. We're fine here. We're fine.
Okay, we're fine. Thrusters. All right. So tell me, why do you find this work interesting, Dr. Lambert?
Oh, it's endlessly fascinating. I'm a physicist by training, so I love tinkering around with all kinds of things that have powerful electromagnetic fields and high voltages and all kinds of interesting materials. So it's really, I'm like a kid in the candy store with this kind of stuff. It's just endlessly fascinating. Science, designing and improving these things. So yeah, it ticks every conceivable box of what I would want to work on.
You have known me for a very long time, and while you know that I am deeply interested in thrusters, I am not so interested really in space tech, or at least I wasn't until you told me all about it. So why is it that non-techies like me should care about what's going on in the in developments in space technology?
Yeah, right. So I think maybe people underestimate just the extent to which space tech influences their lives. So I suppose the most widespread example is simply television. The number one application today for satellites is television. It's a $90 billion a year industry. But also things like
how does that work? Because thrusters and TV, that's basically the thing.
That's right. So the satellites that beam you satellite TV maintain their orbit and position in space using thrusters. That's the application. And of course, again, you want them to make efficient use of their propellant, so they care deeply about the quality of the thrusters on board these satellites. Now, television is kind of it's the dominant form of exploitation of space satellites today, but we're seeing incredibly interesting developments in space tech. For example, many of your listeners will have heard about Elon Musk's venture, his Starlink project, where he's launching thousands upon thousands of satellites into orbit, and they're going to provide broadband internet. This is a really, really interesting beta level product. No one's ever done it before, but he's able to do that because, one, he has access to cheap access to space because he owns SpaceX, and two, because the cost of developing these satellites has absolutely collapsed. So it used to be people would develop satellites that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. We're now looking at simple satellites can cost tens of thousands of dollars, or depending on what you want to do with them. So we're really seeing a big opening up in what's possible in space because these costs are coming down.
I really want to dig into the cost coming down. But before that, I want to understand more about how, people like me, how consumers, or maybe how innovators at large companies are using space tech, probably without actually knowing it. Can you give us more examples?
So best example would be everyone carries around in their pocket a miniature computer that does Google Maps and all these lovely things and does weather forecasts. Google Maps, weather forecasts, these are all running off satellite data. They're pulling as much information as possible from space. Someone else is processing that data and making it relevant to you, showing you the nearest Starbucks or figuring out if it's going to rain in the next 20 minutes. And then they're presenting it on screen, probably with satellite imagery overlaid or something like that. So yeah, we all interact with data from space on almost daily basis.
That's pretty cool.
It is super cool.
So, okay. So now that there are going to be many more satellites, what is it going to mean for products or for innovation? Because at the end of the day, apart from, bored middle-aged men with recent divorces, I'm assuming that there is a commercial imperative to this, right? So what consumer changes, what changes do you forecast that are going to happen essentially in the tech industry or in consumer products as a result of space becoming more accessible?
Well, I think the biggest influence, first of all, is going to be to businesses, and then that's going to filter down into products. So, for example, businesses are getting cheaper and cheaper access to space data. And what is space data? It could be all sorts of things. It could be images the sort that you're used to seeing in Google Maps. But suppose you're interested in plants. Imagine you're a company you're a forestry company. In that case, Google typical satellite imagery is not really what you want. You might want to take images in infrared because that's better for tracking the growth of trees. So you might say, well, look, it would be really nice if there was a company with satellites in orbit that could take images in infrared. And surprisingly, there now is, because it's much cheaper to put specialist application satellites in orbit. So these companies now have access to data that's hyper relevant to their exact use cases. And not only that, the companies that are putting satellites in space, they're not just giving these satellites niche applications. They're learning how to process the data themselves and really reveal insights that they can sell on to their customers. So a lot of the complexity in space has just been transferred to software. A lot of these new space tech companies are really software companies. They put simple tech into orbit, and then they add value by processing that data and selling it on to businesses. So if you want to know, hey, where's a good place to mine for gold? If you want to know how a forest is likely to grow in the next few years, there are companies that will have satellites in space and are able to provide those sorts of insights on the basis of that.
Oh, that's so interesting. So literally, then I can imagine that there will be uses for metals and mining, for all sorts of natural resources, but also I'm assuming a lot of interest from the military, because I can imagine that there will be a lot of interesting military use here.
I think so. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure. I'm not the best person to comment on it, really, because I have no involvement in military matters. But I would say that the military are probably decades ahead, because they've had this sort of technology for a long time. And really, what you're seeing is basically military grade technology going mainstream. So it's a bit like the early days.
Yeah, that's kind of like what happened with the iPhone, isn't it? Because essentially a lot of that technology was developed by the military. Okay, so who is investing in space tech? I mean, apart from you and your co-founder and Elon Musk, who else is participating in this new game?
Well, it's heavily led actually by pretty traditional venture capitalists. Although if you look certainly across Europe, the government does play a much larger role in space tech than it does in, for example, software, typical kind of app type startups. And that's just because traditionally space tech is a riskier investment. The projects take much longer to come to fruition. But that's changing. And people are now beginning to refer to the new space sector. And the new space sector is companies that have lead times of less than a decade and a much better place to bring things to market quickly. Whereas legacy systems would, you start working on a satellite program and it would be 20 years in the making, which is why you had a lot of government involvement. But now you're seeing more and more venture capitalists. You're seeing more and more, excitable billionaires who just want to get involved in space tech in the way they would have got interested in developing apps 10 years ago.
Interesting, yes, because essentially when a venture capital fund invests, they usually have to essentially sell the companies in that fund or do something else with them within 10 years. So a fund is going to have a lifespan of about 10 years. So if you're going to literally be investing and hoping that maybe you'll get a discovery within 20 years, a VC fund is not going to be your target audience. But James, I remember that we talked about Facebook also having investments in space tech. So that means that big tech companies or maybe just large corporates in general are investing in space tech. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I remember the Facebook example actually was I suppose, the opposite of what I've been talking about. So it was a huge, very expensive satellite project that they were going to put in. And when I say huge, I mean one very large satellite that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And their plan was to put this in space and it would provide cheap internet access to the third world. So they can all access Facebook and Facebook can monetize their data.
So it's a bit like what Elon Musk is trying to do with getting people access to the internet via his satellites.
Yeah, but yes, exactly. But very different approach. So whereas Elon Musk is putting thousands of cheap satellites in orbit, Facebook is putting one expensive one in orbit. So, and I consider that kind of to be the old-fashioned approach, kind of the legacy approach. But to be honest, these tech companies have such deep pockets. To me, it just looks like Facebook just dipping their toe in something they find mildly interesting. And if they decide it's even more interesting, they'll go ahead and do it again in a different way.
Okay, so you mentioned that the cost of getting stuff into space has basically come down. And why is that?
Okay, so this is all thanks to people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They have pioneered the concept of reusable rockets, and that's really been an absolute game changer. So, I mean, if you consider launching a heavy spacecraft like a Mars probe, used to cost $200 million, and SpaceX has brought that cost down to below 100 over a period of about 10 years. So not long. You know, not a huge time window there. It's a massive savings. So all of that extra money is available basically to mitigate risk, which means...
So my question is then, why weren't, the Americans or the Russians or the Chinese doing it? Why is there just this bunch of blokes? Seriously, there are science programs, there are governments, there are universities. Why didn't they figure this out?
So interesting, isn't it? Well, I think firstly, bear in mind, SpaceX was founded in the year 2000, and it took them until, I think, 2019 before they had a working reusable launch system. So firstly, it's a massive investment in time with high probability of failure. And I guess it's just that when governments do these things, they're already used to spending enormous amounts of money. They're not looking to find a really cheap way of doing it. They'll say, well, we'll just throw the money at it because we know that space programs are expensive. And it took the private sector to say, well, look, there's an enormous advantage here if we can just do this a lot cheaper.
Interesting. So sometimes it's actually just a question of looking at a problem and just basically saying, no, there is another way. Let's carry on pushing through. So this is really interesting. And what I'm wondering about is that, I'm assuming that there's a lot of investment opportunity now, and there are angel investors and institutional investors that listen to this, but also there are people who want to get enrolled in the tech industry and maybe work for a tech company. And maybe somebody's thinking, yeah, working for a space tech company, that sounds really cool. I want to make thrusters too. I couldn't help myself, James.
You can do it.
But essentially, we're all investors. Whether you're investing your money or your time or your energy, all of these things are they all have an opportunity cost. So when somebody is looking at a range of space tech companies, how should they choose which one is worth investing in?
Ooh, I think firstly you have to really do your homework and look at the pressures that the industry is under. So right now the momentum is with anyone who can reduce costs. That's a big deal. Anyone who can tie a hardware offering to a software offering, that's a big deal because that's where the real value gets added. You build a cheap infrastructure in space and then you sell software products on top of it. That seems to be where a lot of the money is going.
So it's like the Android of space tech.
Yeah. Yeah.
Make a shitty phone and then put Google software into it. I love how this makes
sense. Let's take a moment for a word from our sponsors, Samsung. Thank you, guys.
I think after my vibrator jokes, I don't know if they would want to sponsor me. Unless there is a Samsung vibrator.
Well, I mean, there's probably a vibrator company that would be very keen to get involved in very tech for non-techie people. Yeah.
On that note, where do you believe, do you believe that geopolitical concerns are an investment risk to the space tech sector? Because, there are renewed tensions. And so there is the billionaire space race, but there is also, the traditional kind of, almost the renewal of another space race, a geopolitical space race. Do you think that's going to have an impact on the industry?
I honestly, I don't know, but I think that previously these world powers had a big influence because they were the only people who could put things in orbit. And now that's changing, now that you're having private companies like SpaceX or Blue Origin who can put things in space, that breaks the governments to some degree. It breaks their hold over who can put things in space. So obviously there are limitations. If you went to SpaceX and said, I've built this enormous spy satellite, I'd like to put it in orbit, please, probably there would be bureaucratic hurdles you would have to jump through. But aside from that, no, I think if anything, you're seeing a loss of control from nation states and a transfer of control to the private sector.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Lambert, thank you so much for your wisdom. This has been a super, super interesting deep dive where we've covered a lot of subjects which I did not think.
Diverse, if nothing else.
Yes, indeed. But that's always how we always have our conversations. On that note, thank you very much. And I will be seeing you very, very soon.
Thank you, Sophia.
Wasn't that fascinating? So it's not just old dudes and phallic symbolism. The inventions of private space tech companies like Pulsar, where James works, or the work done by Elon Musk is actually having an impact on gold mining, TV, and rainforests. Still, I'm still going to make fun of thrusters though. Nobody can take that away from me. If you learned something new in this episode, then let me and James know. Leave this podcast a rating and a review. Reviews really help this podcast reach a wider audience, and also they make me happy. And here's a reminder. On Monday, 26th of July, our How to Speak Tech for Leaders course launches. Yay! This is a course for senior executives who want to understand what digital transformation really means in practice. We will cover the basics of digital business, design thinking, agile, and the basics of AI and data science. And if all of these sound just like buzzwords, they won't be buzzwords by the end of this course. They will actually have meaning and practical steps behind them. And by the way, we've already got some really smart, interesting people signed up. So if you join us, you'll be in good company. The link to register is in the show notes, or just go to techfornontechies.co/speak-tech. And that's techfornontechies.co/speak-tech. Okay, that's it for this week, smart people. Go and enjoy the summer of love, and I'll bring you some more learning next week. Ciao.